I'll just give you another introduction.
Okay, you can be super quick.
I'll do it super quick. So Mary McLeod is Professor of History of Architecture at Columbia University. She's studied Le Corbusier for a long time. She is very well known for her thesis that she did about Le Corbusier in the 1930s. She was the first person to really look at what happened to Le Corbusier as his politics moved to the right. And eventually when he, in the Vichy period, when he actually worked on a committee for the planning of France after the war. But she's also worked on a lot of other things, and this is one of her recent pieces of research on the Murondins. And I'll pass you over to Mary to take it on.
Okay. First, let me know. Do you hear me, all of you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And my sincere apologies. I have no idea what happened yesterday. Those of you who came back, you're very brave. I can assure you there would be nobody there if it was Columbia in the days of design reviews. So thank you. And also thank you, Tim, Solomon, for inviting me, Juan for helping me. And I hope I don't repeat too much what you've had already. I'm sure there'll be images you've seen. I was able to hear Tim's wonderful lecture on Maisons and a little bit of Caroline's lecture yesterday, but I don't know totally what you got in the class, although I saw Tim's amazing syllabus. Okay, to start, I'm going to be talking, well, I'll just start this way. Le Corbusier designed 2 projects for refugee housing. And I hope in talking about one of them, I'll raise some issues that might be relevant for thinking about the refugee crisis today. Not that this will be a literal model, but at least a demonstration of one architect's struggle to deal with it. It also represents a side of him that I think, until recently at least, was not very well known. So he designed 2 projects for refugee housing. The first, which I gather you've already talked about, by Tim knows so much, the Maison Domino, which was a response to World War I. And the second, the Maison Murondins, to World War II. In both cases, the devastating destruction of the war provided an opportunity to build and create a new kind of architecture. And today I'm going to focus on the second project, which Le Corbusier hoped would help forge a new kind of rural life, one that would be more collective and participatory, and that would especially enrich the lives of youth. And I'd also like to propose that this project produce radical transformation in both his architecture and social vision during the interwar and Vichy years. Le Corbusier and his partner, Pierre Jeanneret, began working on the Maison Murondins in May 1940, almost immediately after the German invasion of Belgium and France. Thousands had been forced to flee their homes. As Le Corbusier wrote to a letter to a friend, and we can't actually identify which friend, the handwriting is so bad, dated June 1st, 1940, there was neither the time nor resources for industrial reorganization. The needs were too immense and too urgent. As he declared in the letter, we must make do with nothing. Like the word domino, the name Murondin was a neologism. Mur for wall and rondin for logs. Le Corbusier intended these temporary structures to be built by the residents themselves, a kind of self-build architecture without any special expertise, using whatever materials were available. It could be sand, logs from the forest, branches, and sod. So he saw it as being adapting to the local terrain. The walls could be made of pisé, the kind of French word for adobe bricks, or simply blocks of earth with a little lime added, a kind of rammed earth structure, or even masonry stone or bricks retrieved from destroyed or crumbling structures resulting from the devastation of the war. The walls were to be 2 meters high or 4 in exceptional circumstances. And those of you who know anything about earthen construction know that one of the real limits is height. So these were low buildings, and to be placed, as Le Corbusier explained, to ensure stability. These interlocking L's would then create cells of space, which could be placed side by side to accommodate various programs. The roofs were to be constructed of logs, rondins, nailed or pegged together to horizontal sawn timber with a covering of foliage and grass sod. You see the green, or a simple system of lathwork with plaster and tar paper, as in the illustration on the right. The floor, Le Corbusier said, could be made of almost anything. It could simply be packed dirt, wood, or cement. Only the windows and fittings required the skill of a local carpenter. If the project retained the notion of modular repetition that we know from his earlier work up to then, in most ways, it was the opposite of the earlier Domino project. In its primitivism, its wallness, and I'm inverting here Peter Eisman's term for domino. He always called it slabness. Its interlocking spaces, and its rejection of all attempts to revolutionize or modernize modern architecture. It was meant, first and foremost, to be a proposal that could be built quickly and at minimal expense. In fact, it seems to have originated in a request from the Undersecretary of State for Labor, Philippe Serre, an independent leftist, and Deputy Premier Camille Chauton to design provisional housing for refugee children. Le Corbusier hoped to find an alternative to the military-style barracks that he had originally proposed when they first contacted him. Here's an early drawing. The large span structures were too expensive, but more important, he decided the interior spaces were, quote, morose, without soul. And here you see his sketch of an early project, as he later published in his little booklet on Les Murondins. Le Corbusier and Jeanneret's first site plan for Les Maisons Murondins, and it looks like it's still barrack buildings, was dated June 5th, 1940, and intended for 160 children. And it was to be located in their beloved Le Piquet on the bay of Arcachon, where the two partners had so often vacationed together, but which was now occupied, as was most of the Atlantic coast, by German troops. Only 7 days later, June 14th, Paris would fall. Le Corbusier fled Paris with his wife and Pierre Jeanneret to Ozon, a small village in the foothills of the Hautes-Pyrénées, which was still in French territory. And in this delightful letter to his mother, you can see the two houses where he lived. They still exist, a little altered in this very isolated little village. The lower one is Corbusier, the one up above, as he notes, is Pierre. There, in these two residences, he and Pierre continued to work on the project. Le Corbusier doing sketches illustrating the steps of construction and interior spaces, and Pierre the hardline detailed drawings. At this stage, Le Corbusier also showed how the Murondins system might be used to build temporary farms and a variety of social amenities, including workshops, meeting halls, a regional museum, and clubs. In other words, public buildings for makeshift villages. The most important structure that he proposed for this refugee village was the Maison de Jeunes, or the youth building, a facility most likely inspired by a youth center he had designed the year before, which was a renovation of existing warehouses in Paris, again at the request of the leftist Philippe Serre. Here you see the plan. This is a project that never made it into the œuvre complète and is very little known. Tim has actually referred to it. And like that project, the Murondins Center featured one of the things that's sort of interesting and important about this youth center that he did in Paris, this renovation, was that he made his first mural, or so he claims, on one wall. And he was very concerned about this mural, even writing a Vichy minister if it still existed. What, Tim?
No, it's okay. You disappeared for a moment, but it's back.
Okay. Anyway, like that project, this project, the Murondins Center featured a large communal room. This is one of the few spaces that was double height that Le Corbusier said could be used for movies, temporary exhibitions, and plays, as well as a library, workshops, an art room, and even a place for bicycle storage. It also housed a small regional museum. You see it in the long bar on the top. By the way, just a second, and a reception space for refugees and visitors. So he really thought it was important that refugee camps or refugee places, for him it was always a village, had public amenities, that life shouldn't just be bare shelter. His sketches for the village, done that fall, this is the fall of 1940, also show a swimming pool, sports fields, gardens, and what he called école volante, or flying schools. The latter were demontable buildings made of sheet metal hollow tube frames and exterior wooden panels, which he and Jeanneret had designed with Jean Prouvé in 1939. And there's the interior sketch of the school. Le Corbusier imagined this small complex of buildings as one that would integrate, as he wrote, naturally with the landscape and create what he called picturesque groupings in a variety of terrains. And in fact, this use of the word picturesque, I would like to note, something that he really wouldn't have used regularly or positively in the 20s. Once these temporary villages were no longer needed, they might, he proposed, be used as vacation centers, summer camps, or other recreational facilities for the young. Le Corbusier hoped to create not only a humane settlement for refugees and displaced rural residents, one that would foster creative endeavors and active participation in sports, but also a place after the war where urban residents might be revitalized by nature and the simple pleasures of life. However, before I discuss his intentions and a small booklet about the project from which these sketches come, I would like to consider what might have led to his solution, or this solution that seems so different from both Domino and most of his architecture of the 1920s. At a formal level, his willingness to use regional materials and the most basic of building techniques can be linked to his lifelong sympathy for vernacular architecture. And I'm sure Tim has discussed this, whether it's the traditional Balkan or Turkish houses that he sketched during his youthful travels, The favelas in Rio, which he sketched in his trip of 1929, the Muslim dwellings in the Kasbah of Algiers, and the villages of the Emzab. This is the summer settlement that he sketched in Gardea in the early 30s, or even the modest old houses at Vézelay, which Joan Buttavici, and maybe, we're not at all sure, Eileen Gray had renovated with such care. And I gather you talked about these at some length. If his interest in these modest dwellings was originally tied to his search for another vision of housing, one stripped of the style and bourgeois convention, by the late 1920s, he seemed to appreciate vernacular dwellings simply on their own terms. This can be seen first and most polemically in his 1928 book, which I think you read a big passage, Une Maison en Palais, where he juxtaposes on the cover a wooden fisherman's shack with his League of Nations competition entry, and then during the 1930s in his own residential designs, which in many regards rejected his earlier 5 points. In the unbuilt Errázuriz house in Chile, which used, as you can see, rondons, if also still as vertical posts. Then in Hélène Mandreau's house near Toulon, with its rubble walls. After that, the house at Mott, which was built of wood and local stone and had an inverted pitched roof, and the Maison de Weekend at La Selle Saint-Cloud, sadly very transformed, with its vaults, brick walls, and prominent hearth. Le Corbusier's paintings also changed dramatically during this period, including scenes of fisherwomen, shells, rustic carts. It's as if the pristine precision of purism was now replaced by what one might call a more organic or biomorphic sensibility, one in which his appreciation of folklore and regional culture was no longer overshadowed by his commitment to mass production and a new architecture. The two really exist simultaneously, but what I'm trying to stress is that this takes a new prominence. However, I would also mention two other sources for the rubble wall and use of local materials. His proposals for the Maison Louchure, which I know Tim mentioned, and the Village Radieux. Although both projects were intended to be largely prefabricated, the 1929 Maison Louchure featured a load-bearing, rough stone wall, which was to be built by local masons, in part to keep trade unions content. And here you see the plan with that rubble wall, but the rest of the project very much a sort of highly tuned prefabricated dwelling. Likewise, the buildings of the 1934 Village Radieux had partition and infill walls, which were to be made of local stone or rubble, and again, erected by local residents. The concrete roof vaults, he said, would be covered with wild grasses and grains, joining the building to quote the surrounding landscape. And it really is one of the first early proposals that I know of for a green roof, along with his own later addition to his mother's petite maison. This incipient regionalism was not simply a formal or aesthetic shift, but one I would propose was directly related to the political and social underpinnings of the ferme and village projects, and more generally, Le Corbusier's rather hard to pinpoint political orientation in the 1930s. From 1931 to to 1936, he was actively involved with a small, rather obscure political movement, which I'm translating as regional syndicalism. You can see on the upper right of the Prelude publication, regionaliste et syndicaliste. Usually in French, the words were separated. And he wrote for and helped edit 3 neo-syndicalist publications. Plan, 1931 to 32. You see a later rendition, well, not here. Prelude, 33 to 36, and L'Ombriel, which is on the left, 1934. The name itself, regional syndicalism, indicates the movement's 2 major tenets. Syndicalism, or trade unionism, alludes to the pre-war syndicalist movement in France, which called for government by unions for unions. In essence, this meant a kind of decentralized socialism in which administration was based on economic units rather than political structures. And I would just like to stress the upward moving arrows and the notion of control on the right that goes upward from the base to the top, and only information and kind of administrative functions would be from the top down. This meant, in essence, as I said, a kind of decentralized socialism in which administration really was to be kept to a minimum. Besides economic units, or what he's calling syndicats, or in this moment, sort of harking back to the past, les métiers, the Prelude group called for regional administrative units whose frontiers would be determined by purportedly natural criteria, such as climate, topography, language, and you can see it in the diagram. It moves from region, tribe, family. These were to be the kind of determinants of boundaries as opposed to old national boundaries. Le Corbusier illustrated this dual structure governing model, economic and geographic, in diagrams published in Prelude, which he later published in La Ville Radieuse. As much as political reform, the neo-syndicalists hoped that these new forms of organization would bring spiritual and emotional rejuvenation to France, replacing the sterility of capitalism. These are images from the magazine Plan, and parliamentary democracy. And here, despite his association with Taylorism in the 20s, he picked out most of the images himself. We know this actually from correspondence, as well as I heard from one of the editors, L'Amour. Here's a cartoon ridiculing Taylorism and American attributes, money, corned beef, business, and juxtaposing that position with what he sees as the vie intérieure, the spirituality of Gardea, the village I showed you from the Emzab in the Sahara of Algiers. They were torn, basically opposed to parliamentary democracy because it had gone through one change after another in France. I think unless you know the history of France in the 30s, it's hard to understand that this country in depression, with strikes, going through one government after another, there was big questions about democracy, and they debated this in the magazine Plan, a later rendition of it by Mensuel. They considered themselves neither right nor left, neither capitalist or Marxist. And if you read carefully, they reject the fascism of Italy as too corporate, wanting a more decentralized model of government, but still very much tied to unions or métier. Now, why is this important? As part of their regionalist, oh, here are some images, also just giving the aesthetic sensibility. As I said, Corbu chose these of this movement. Images of Africa, child drawings, peasant drawings. These were all published in Plan. And I just would like to contrast it with like the images in Vers in Architecture with the Acropolis or Esprit Nouveau of the Acropolis and the automobile. It's a very different sensibility. Now, as part of their regionalist agenda, these neo-syndicalists sought rural reform. The Prelude group believed firmly that the participation of both peasants and workers was essential to any major social transformation. As one editorial declared, the peasant and the worker must walk hand in hand. The peasantry and their rural life represented for this group an alternative to the artifice and corruption that the group saw as having become rampant in present-day France. A sketch by Le Corbusier showing this joint endeavor of workers and peasants that became a maquette in his later Automne Nouveau pavilion in 1937. It was through this movement that Le Corbusier, and a contact that Le Corbusier had with a peasant activist named Norbert Bézard. Unfortunately, I don't have a young photo of him, just one from the 50s. I would suggest that his interest in rural reorganization emerged, and specifically his proposals for the Ferme Radieuse and Village Radieux. At some point in 1933, Bézard wrote Le Corbusier asking him to undertake a project for his old village, Piace, located in the Sarthe department north of Le Mans, which had repeatedly suffered from flooding. The two of them worked closely together, studying local conditions and meeting with peasant groups to discuss the project for a new community. In fact, Le Corbusier even spent one of his summer vacations in this region to better get to know it. And if it's hard to believe that Le Corbusier, here are images of the village as it existed when I visited quite a few years ago, but I suspect it hasn't changed much. And as I said, they were working very closely together. And I almost see this collaboration as a kind of incipient form, if you will, of advocacy planning as it came to be known in the 60s. Although the final scheme certainly shows Le Corbusier's aesthetic and technological futurism. Here, by the way, are diagrams and sketches by Norbert Bézard, which he presented actually at the 1937 CM Congress. The final scheme by Corbu looks very Corbusian, not like Bézard's little sketches, except of his project, and certainly shows his aesthetic control and technological futurism. And I might note, look on the left, at the cloverleaf, kind of absurd for this little town of village of like 400 residents, but it was supposedly inspired by the New Jersey Turnpike that he had in his files. The village center included a cooperative silo, garage store, school, and most important, this is number 7, a club, including a library, meeting hall, and even a regional museum, just as he had in that collective building in Les Murondins. Here, Le Corbusier was influenced not only by his new political comrades, but also by his experience in the Soviet Union and his discussion with the young ethnographer Georges-Henri Rivière, who had studied rural life and was a strong advocate of regional folklore and regional museums. Well, the proposal retained the small, privately owned family farm, and hardly could be seen as an example of vernacular construction. By the way, the regional syndicalists, who were generally against private property, thought the only kind of property that could be owned, sort of following the ideology of Thomas Aquinas, if you will, was that of people who worked the land. And they thought the conditions of hedgerow, the local terrain of rolling hills, what the French call bocage, was especially suited for small family farms. But the new public amenities facilities were explicitly meant to be collective and participatory and cooperatively owned and run. Le Corbusier had no interest, and this is important, in imposing Parisian high art or avant-garde culture on these rural residents. Instead, he envisioned farm laborers, perhaps not quite acknowledging how tired many of them must have been at long days of labor, putting on theatrical events and youths working in the photography laboratory of the club. It is this new focus on peasant life and rural traditions, as well as a sincere belief in a kind of grassroots participation and collective public life, that I believe lies at the base of his Murondins proposal. But his project for refugee housing and provisional villages did not get built, and is too often the case with our protagonist, that is Corbu. It has a much more troubling history, one that reflects the split between Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier, and perhaps explains why Pierre's name is left off the project in the 4th volume of the Œuvre Complète, which splits authorship if you look at it. Shortly after he arrived in Ozon, Le Corbusier began to court the Vichy government and its war hero, Maréchal Pétain, sometimes known as the Maréchal Paysan, as a way to revitalize France. That November, that is November 1940, Le Corbusier wrote a manuscript called Les Maisons Murondins, now envisioning the project would be constructed by one of Vichy's youth groups, the Compagnons de France, young men from 15 to 19, and he actively sought the support of its founder and head, a guy named Henri Devernat, and he's writing, getting a response from this other member of the group. Moved by the plight of homeless children and youths separated from their families, Devernat had formed the organization as a way to help these often stranded youths. And I might mention that Devernat later became part of the resistance, that this group even included Jewish youths, as we've learned in recent studies. Its ideology is a little hard to kind of quite summarize easily. It was a kind of mixture of what we might call personalism, a Catholic social movement, discipline, kind of like Boy Scouts, and communitarianism. It was meant to save these young men from the hazards of unemployment and the dangers of dissidence. The youth group, which never had more than about 30,000 volunteers, which actually sounds like a lot to me, assisted in a range of outdoor activities, such as harvesting crops, clearing more rubble, forestry, and road building. They also were involved in cultural activities such as theater productions. Although Le Corbusier does not explicitly refer to the Compagnons in his text, except in one caption where you notice it's lowercase, generally he uses the more generic phrase cercle de jeunesse, or youth circle. The book was published in 1942 under the patronage of the Secretary General of Youth at Vichy. Le Corbusier himself called the booklet a petit cadeau, a little gift to his friends, the youths of France. In many regards, Les Constructions Murondins is Le Corbusier at his most lyrical and charming. He opens it by writing, "You will be charged with awakening parts of the country, with your efforts, using your hands, your enterprising spirit, your courage, your invention, your emotion, and individual participation." Note that word participation. He then goes on to describe how the healthy, passionate youths, after they build the simple structures, might paint them, first whitewashing them, and then applying, quote, bursts of bright color here and there, so the structures will stand joyously in the countryside. And of the new houses, he writes, their joviality, their exuberance, full of life, their enthusiasm, their faith will make miracles. I think Tim mentioned the word miracle in Le Corbusier, here perhaps a little different from espace, the ineffable space, or espace indicible, but that notion of miracle, this sort of creation, something special that art can bring, even the art of youth's painting. He ends the text saying, "Good luck, amiably, Le Corbusier." However naively, Le Corbusier had put his faith in the new government. He hoped, despite the despair of defeat, that it would bring a cleansing of France and that it would be a means to realize not only his architectural projects, but also aspects of his regional syndicalist program. There is no discussion of this in the booklet, or even an overt sign of his new political sympathies, except one brief statement. Your initiative will take on national character, a national utility. The most local of initiatives, which had links to a grassroots regionalist philosophy, now had an overtly nationalist agenda, one so completely foreign to the tone of his writings in the 1930s, and one might even claim alien to the internationalism of much of his work in the 1920s. By January 1941, he had moved to Vichy to campaign for his projects. Pierre had gone to Renault and worked as a messenger for the resistance. Two of his Le Corbusier's regional syndicalist colleagues who had worked with him on Plan and Prelude, Pierre Winter and Francois de Pierrefeu, also joined Le Corbusier in Vichy. Needless to say, Les Murondins was rejected by the Maréchal's new government, as were all of Le Corbusier's schemes. By the fall of 1942, he had quit Vichy, disillusioned and bitter. We're left again with the paradox of a man, one who sincerely wished, I believe, to revitalize the French countryside in the face of its devastation, but one who also, whether owing to opportunism, naivete, egoism, undoubtedly all three, made without question the wrong political choice, a choice with disturbing, potentially tragic consequences. However, this isn't quite the end of the story. Excuse me. Le Corbusier continued to write about Les Murondins, promoting it in a 1943 publication, Agriculture and Community, which you see here. And here are the sketches of the Murondins that were published in it. In November 1944, as the Germans were fleeing Eastern France, Le Corbusier designed a variation of the Murondin unit to serve as provisional housing lodgings in destroyed towns, suggesting that the residents might be grouped in a sort of horseshoe pattern, like a gypsy camp, he wrote, though without any collective amenities other than essential playing fields for youth. He recognized that that would have to happen later. And in 1945, he proposed the Murondins system might be used in the devastated city of Saint-Dié until the more permanent unité type housing could be erected. And he published this in Technique Architecture, July 1945. He also designed another variation, which he called the Mesopotamian house, again using pisé or earthen walls. For Le Corbusier, for La Rochelle Police, and here you see a drawing. Once more, these projects were not realized. Apparently in Saint-Dié, because nature did not cooperate. The region had the wrong kind of clay, as he explains. But even long before after the armistice, Les Murondins continued to preoccupy Le Corbusier. In February 1955, he offered the project gratuit, free, although it's unclear if this offer included village plans, as a solution for France's homelessness to Faim et Soif, Hunger and Thirst, the publication of Abbé Pierre's amazing group, explaining that it would allow individuals to construct their own homes immediately. I don't know how much all of you know about Abbé Pierre, but he was an amazing social activist priest, Abbé, who tried to help the homeless in Paris. And I never quite understood if Corbusier thought these Murondins could be built in Paris or not. Needless to say, it didn't happen. And in 1963, only 2.5 years before his death, he again offered it as a cadeau or gift, this time to house Les Harkis, the controversial French Muslims who had supported and worked for the French in Algeria and had to flee after the war for independence. In his letter to Alexandre Parodi, the head of the National Committee for French Muslims, he ridicules the, quote, expensive and luxurious youth centers being built with public funds in France. He then recounts his own youth, saying how much he enjoyed constructing huts of wood and straw when he went camping. And he assures Parodi that he's not relaying this anecdote to make light of his proposition, but to the contrary, to ennoble it by, quote, humanizing it. And it's this simple humanization that gives us, I think, a clue to the meaning of Les Murondins to Le Corbusier. Why, in his architecture after the war, the walls remained in Saint-Baume, Sarabai, which I know Caroline showed yesterday, and which she showed at even more length, Maisons, and even the logs in his cabanon, as did his yearnings for a simpler, more elemental life, one closely tied to nature and full of joy, what he called an architecture de bonheur, an architecture of happiness. But whether the villages, if built, would have offered the same happiness to their proposed residents, be they war victims, homeless Parisians, or displaced Algerians, also desperate for shelter, I think is another more difficult question. But what I do think, or at least something we should consider, is that he was concerned for these most desperate homeless residents, a problem we of course face today. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to answer any questions if there are.
Any questions? Do we have a mic?
There's no mic.
No mic, okay.
But it picks up that you can hear some now, that's why.
Okay, can you hear us when we
I
talk?
can't hear what the question was.
No, there wasn't a question yet. There wasn't a question yet.
Oh, okay. I can hear you, Tim.
Yeah, can I just say comment on one thing, which is I think it's so wonderful the way Mary represents this the political strand in Corbusier going through to Vichy, without diabolizing it. And just to make a link with Stanley's discussion today,
what did Donnie do? Did he discuss the core stuff, or what did he talk about?
Stanley talked about a trip in 1945 to Switzerland.
Oh, I wish I heard this. I wanted so much to. I hope it's online because I really want to learn about that trip. Okay.
Yeah. So Paulon was, as you said, quite rightly, somebody who worked for the resistance and risked his life in the resistance, in fact. But he was also a collaborator. He was the editor of Gallimard, which was the official French.
Yeah, no, this double role is so common, and I was reading recently a French novel, which really kind of got at that complexity, where there would be even people collaborating as a cover-up for resistance activities. The boundaries are not so black and white, which I'm sure Stani talked about.
Right. Okay, so any questions? I think that the Murondins is such a wonderful example, contrasting with the other things that we've been looking at. Any questions for Mary?
I have a question for the audience, or for you, Tim, about why it's almost like these sort of modest projects. Frank Lloyd Wright did something with Earth and Structure too in the 40s. They get kind of left out of the canon, and they almost belie that famous juxtaposition between Lincoln Cathedral and the I don't know what architecture and shelter get very blurred in the practice of these people. And I think maybe mistakenly we're too ready to label them, elitist, haute bourgeois practitioners, associating them only with these very, luxe villas, which are part of their practice without question, but belying, if you will, especially in recent discussions, a social side to them as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, Mary, I think some other architects worked also on earth architecture during the war. And,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I was thinking, do you know, for example, the work of Bossu? B-O-S-S-U?
Not well, but I know. I mean, I'm sort of obsessed with earth and architecture, which of course is crazy for someone living in New York where it makes no sense. But tell me about both of the projects, Caroline. I know that wonderful catalog that happened at Centre Pompidou on earth and architecture.
But probably the catalog of the work on earth and architecture done by Jean de Thiers, a long time ago. I'm not sure if he's talking about Bossu, but Bossu.
I don't think he did. I think he was more involved with African examples and other examples, more traditional.
But Bossu was able to work on it's not an entire village, but several buildings or a farm in Normandy. And Normandy was also a right place to work on earth architecture during the war. But Bossu did a very interesting realization there, and I will send you some reference about it.
And it's interesting.
I would be very interested. And I assume it was not right at the coast under German occupation.
No, it's not.
Because in Normandy, there's a big tradition for Pise architecture. Which you see it.
And you probably know as well, around Lyon, Peter Collins in his book on concrete talks about the tradition of Pizet in France. I think we somehow ignore these traditions too often in Europe.
Yep. And to make a connection with what you said, Le Corbusier said, Bossu Jean Bossu was one of Corbusier's important assistants in the 1930s.
Yes.
And Le Corbusier sent him to Gardaya and the Mazab to make drawings.
He did. I didn't know that. How wonderful.
Yeah.
So when did he go to Gardea?
He went, I think, in 37 or 38, something like that.
Okay. Well, he was deeply inspired, I always feel, by that trip to the MZAB. You see images of one of the mosques that looks like Ronchamp a little bit later. You see these structural, these very broad supports that remind you of his later pilotis. Not that it didn't have precedence in the Swiss pavilion. There are just so many images that I think may have inspired him. But of course, Corbu, as Tim knows better than most, and Caroline, it's always multifaceted. There are always many, that kind of fashionable term of historians, overdetermined, comes to mind.
Yep. Max. Yeah. Max Wieselauder is here.
Oh, great, Max.
I was thinking about, instead of going back to the earth, of course, there is also a solution for those people who were driven away from the places and things like that, is the more going to the air. I mean, the technological way of solving it in, let's say, tent constructions. So the development of tent constructions was, I think, very important also in that period.
And even more today with the
and even more today. I mean,
well,
let's say the nomadic, so what the nomads had with them was also something very light. And so when they came to a certain place, they could build it up very easily. But it had nothing to do with the locality. So it was a place which could be put everywhere. So that's
and it's interesting because Corbu obviously was interested in tents, or Pierre Jeanneret was, at least, with Tom Nouveau, but I think he wanted a more permanent solution, something that would be later used. But it is interesting that he opted for these earthen structures as opposed to tents, because I think, and of course now almost a lot of refugee housing are tents. I think Shigeru Ban has proposed some other alternative ideas using cardboard and other solutions depending on the climate. But it is curious that he's, 1937 is a tent building, and yet he goes to these earthen structures.
There's one of the points that you
about Buckminster Fuller in the end, which was Buckminster Fuller developed systems in which you could stay. It's not to move around. Yeah. So this is how can I say?
The only thing he wanted, sorry to interrupt. The only thing he wanted to move around, because he didn't think, were the schools, because he thought there wasn't, he stuck with this Privé solution of the École Volante, thinking that the school could be moved to one community for 3 months and then moved to another. I don't know that it's all very rationally worked out, if I'm honest about this. And ironically, he thought Privé's little solution for Abbé Pierre, you probably know that charming little booklet about Abbé Pierre's, Privé's little proposal. Corbu called it the most beautiful building in the world. So I think he acknowledged that Privé's solution made more sense than his Murondins.
But I think what you show very well, Mary, is that the Murondin idea had two essential components for him. One was self-build, but that had a kind of ethical, moral quality to it. And the other was disurbanization. It was putting back into the land. Whereas these tents, terrible refugee camps, are all walled, enclosed places. And that's the value of the tent, is it's very high density.
Yeah, I think the land and this sense of community and this idea of participation was very strong in him. I don't know if any of you remember the comments he makes in the CM meeting in 51, where he's almost ridiculing some of the rhetoric around synthesis of the arts, like artists coming to decorate. I mean, this is all ironic given his own murals, but he basically doesn't think some Parisian artists should come in and decorate buildings, that they should be done by the residents themselves. And you know, as I said, he's a man full of contradictions. Why it's okay for him to decorate buildings and not anybody else is another question.
Yes, Stanley.
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Just did you follow up on that letter that you quote, where he refers to his youth and the vacations that he took, and that they were building huts like the Indians and so on? He's pretty romantic about this. And to see you and to see Corb on the screen in what, after all, is not a refugee camp, but a vacation place, and also think of the 4 barrack-like constructions, which are a vacation location. I'm really also intrigued by the structural analogy between the Murondin idea on the one hand and the nomadism of contemporary tourists. I mean, down to Club Méditerranée, where I think these ideas have had an incredible following and have become part of everyday culture, with the tents and with the camps and with the boats and everything that is glorified in a more moral perspective by Corbusier, but has become part of our daily lives in contemporary culture. And I find it, I'm following up on this because he himself indicates that Ali, in this letter that you're referring to, where he refers to his youth as a vacation. And he is a vacationer. I mean, this the hut here. I mean, his redefinition of the primitive hut, in a sense, also has been multiplied by all the camp, the tourist camps in contemporary nomadic life.
And he did designs he had this idea that Barbaris was going to manufacture these in pairs of cabanons connected by an open space. And he thought that Barbaris would make a lot of money with this, and he gave him this plan, to Barbaris to make, because nothing happened. Because the other thing is, the 1930s, one of the big issues was the problem of leisure.
Yes.
So that was discussed. The weekend house, there were competitions, there were, what do you do with your leisure time? And that, in a sense, previews the problem of the refugee.
Yeah, I think I mean, Stani's right to point to this paradox, but of course the legislation of the Popular Front guaranteeing a vacation and Corbusier's own interest in leisure, rest, escape. I think what he was trying to do in that letter, and it is very romantic, is saying these aren't horrible structures. I even enjoy them. He's trying to say that this primitivism doesn't mean necessarily bad, although you could push back on that nobody wants that permanently. It's one thing to go for a few weeks every summer. It's another thing to spend all your time. But he was very conscious of that because he proposes that these refugee camps could become vacation centers. So he's aware of, he puts together the two things, rightly or wrongly. I I also think, I mean, the issue of mass leisure, you're totally right, Stani, just emerges full force after in the early 50s with Club Mediterranee, and it's an issue. But I think he would have endorsed definitely the idea of going back to the land, rural communities, escape, whatever you want to call it. Of course, Roquebrune wasn't quite the place of Russian oligarchs when he built the Cabanon, but it certainly was not unprivileged.
Yes, Max?
No, I think the students are ready for us.
Oh, sorry. What, the students?
No, I mean, we have to talk with them also.
Yes, exactly, yes, so, students, questions?
No, I mean, to present-
presentation of the
Time otherwise.
Okay, Mary, yes.
Sorry.
The participants in the seminar have set up an exhibition, so they're going to present. So we shouldn't go on too much longer than that.
No, that's fine. I understand. I'm amazed anyone is, as I said, at Columbia, getting someone on the day of a design review would be impossible. So
They're
thank
a
you
good
all
group.
very
They're a
much.
good group. Okay, thanks again.
Bye.
Thank you. And nice to see old friends. Thanks so much for inviting me.
That's great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mary. I'm so glad it went well perfectly this time.
I'm glad too. Thanks.